The cold arrives before you understand what cold is, not the cold of a bad winter, not the cold of a broken heater on a January morning, something else entirely. A cold that kills everything green, a cold that turns the sky white for months, a cold that rewrites the planet, and somehow your ancestors survived it. Not once, not by accident. For roughly 100,000 years, Homo sapiens endured conditions that make the harshest modern winters look like a mild afternoon. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, hit around 26,000 years ago. Global temperatures dropped between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius lower than today. Ice sheets 2 miles thick buried what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and Northern Europe. The oceans shrank. The Sahara was colder and drier than it is today. And the megafauna, the woolly mammoths, cave lions, giant hyenas, were very real and very hungry. You had no metal tools, no synthetic insulation, no stored reserves beyond what you and your group could carry. So how did they do it? The answer is not a single genius idea. It is a layered system, biological, social, behavioral, and cognitive, that your body still carries the evidence of today. Start with what happened to your body. Anthropologists studying skeletal remains from Ice Age populations in Europe and Siberia have found a striking pattern. People from this period tended to have shorter limbs relative to their torso. This is not a coincidence. It is a physical adaptation called Bergmann's rule. The principle that bodies in colder climates tend to be more compact to preserve heat. A shorter arm loses less warmth than a long one. A stockier frame retains core temperature better in freezing conditions. Your distant ancestors did not choose this. Evolution quietly shaped it over tens of thousands of years because the people who kept warmer bodies survived longer and had more children. But the body alone cannot survive an ice age. The mind has to go to work too. Here is where the evidence becomes remarkable. In 2012, archaeologist Francesco D'Errico and his team published findings from a site in southern Africa called Blombos Cave. The cave contained ochre, a reddish mineral pigment that had been processed and mixed into compounds as far back as 100,000 years ago. What does pigment have to do with surviving an ice age? Everything. Ochre was used for body decoration, for marking territory, for communicating group identity. It is evidence that by this point, modern humans were already engaging in symbolic thinking, the cognitive ability to represent abstract ideas like belonging, identity, and alliance. That is the foundation of complex social cooperation. And complex social cooperation is what kept you alive. Think about what surviving winter in the Pleistocene, that is the geological epoch that lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to around 12,000 years ago, actually required. You needed shelter, you needed fire, you needed enough food stored or hunted to last through periods when the ground was frozen and the herds had moved on. No single person can do all of these. No single family can either. So let us reconstruct what life actually looked like. You are somewhere in what is now southwestern France, roughly 25,000 years ago. Your group, probably between 20 and 50 people, has been tracking a herd of reindeer for 3 days. The reindeer migrate predictably. Your group knows this. The knowledge of when to move, where the herds go in winter, where the best caves are located along the route. This information has been passed down across generations through oral tradition and direct teaching. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying hunter-gatherer societies and documented how critical nighttime storytelling was for transmitting survival knowledge. It was not entertainment, it was the archive. Around a fire, in a language only your group fully understood, the practical facts of the world were encoded in narrative and passed on. Your group finds a limestone cave. The entrance is low and narrow, defensible. Inside, the rock holds warmth. Someone begins preparing a fire using a bow drill, 2 pieces of wood, a spindle, and friction. This technology is at least 400,000 years old, possibly older. The fire does more than warm you. It changes the chemistry of what you eat. Cooked food delivers more calories per gram than raw food, which means your brain, an organ that burns roughly 20% of your daily energy, can stay sharp on less food. Evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham argued in his 2009 book, Catching Fire, that cooking was not simply a convenience, but a biological necessity that reshaped the human body and brain over evolutionary time. Now, the clothing. This is one of the most underestimated technological achievements in human history. Around 120,000 years ago, humans in Africa were already processing animal hides. By the time the Ice Age reached its peak, the people of Siberia and Eastern Europe were producing sophisticated layered garments. We know this not from the clothing itself, which does not survive, but from the needles. Bone needles, thin, precisely shaped, with a drilled eye, have been found at sites in Siberia dating to at least 50,000 years ago. You do not need a needle with an eye unless you are sewing pieces of material together. And you do not sew pieces of material together unless you are building fitted, insulated garments. Let that sink in. 50,000 years ago, someone in Siberia was threading sinew through the eye of a bone needle, stitching fitted clothing designed to trap body heat. The same basic engineering principle used in modern high-performance cold weather gear, but shelter, fire, and clothing still leave an enormous problem. Food. In winter, the plant foods your group normally relies on, tubers, berries, seeds, are gone. The frozen ground gives nothing. The herds move in patterns that are sometimes predictable and sometimes not. So how do you eat? 3 answers. First, fat. Large amounts of fat. Researchers like John Spieth at the University of Michigan have written extensively about the centrality of animal fat in Ice Age diets. Not just protein, fat. Fat is calorie dense. It metabolizes slowly. It keeps you warm from the inside. Your ancestors hunted not just for meat, but specifically for fatty animals. Woolly mammoths, aurochs, bison. The marrow inside long bones was cracked out and consumed. Nothing was wasted. The fat you could store in your own body before winter arrived was itself a kind of biological food reserve. Second, storage. Some Ice Age groups stored food externally. At sites like Malta in Siberia, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated campsites with pit features that may have functioned as cold storage caches, essentially natural freezers dug into the permafrost. Frozen meat holds for weeks or months. If you could kill a large animal in autumn and cache a portion of it, you extended your survival window significantly. Third, mobility. When food was scarce in one area, you moved. This is not wandering, it is a strategic mobility, a decision made based on accumulated knowledge of the landscape, the migration routes of prey, and the seasonal patterns of plant resources across a territory that might span hundreds of miles. Researcher James Sussman in his study of the Zhuhuanzi people of the Kalahari, documented this logic in living hunter-gatherers. Movement is not desperation, it is intelligence. But there is something else, something that the physical evidence points to more clearly the further we go. The counterintuitive twist is this: the Ice Age did not just threaten human survival, it may have accelerated human evolution. Genetic research published in the journal Nature in 2016 found evidence of significant population bottlenecks, drastic reductions in human population size during periods of intense cold. In some regions, human populations may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals. The groups that survived were not necessarily the strongest or the biggest. They were the most cooperative, the most socially cohesive, the ones with the richest stores of shared knowledge, the deepest networks of alliance across groups, and the most sophisticated communication. The Ice Age selected for intelligence, for language, for culture, for the very traits that define what you recognize as human. This is what the cave paintings at Chauvet Cave in southern France whisper, made roughly 36,000 years ago during one of the coldest periods your ancestors ever faced. Not desperate scrawls of people barely hanging on. Accomplished, precise, emotionally resonant art. Horses, aurochs, cave lions, rendered by firelight deep inside a limestone cave. People who were cold and hungry still found time to make something beautiful. That impulse, that investment in meaning and expression, even under extreme pressure, is the thing that survived. That is what you inherited. You will never face an ice age, but when the winter comes and the world feels impossible and the warmth feels very far away, somewhere in the ancient architecture of your brain, a memory still stirs. The fire, the needle, the story told by flickering light, the knowledge passed from hand to hand across unimaginable years. Your ancestors did not just survive the cold. They used it to become more fully themselves. That is what the cold does when you know how to face it.